According to a shocking new poll, 20% of Republicans want Donald Trump to declare the upcoming election invalid if he loses, and 30% of Republicans think violence might be necessary to reclaim the country. Relatedly, Politico did a deep dive about the unlikely but terrifyingly plausible path Donald Trump has to steal the 2024 election, succeeding where he failed in 2020. These are all terrifying, but we have to talk about it. And before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, no clips in this particular video, but a lot of information to discuss, a shocking new poll, a deep dive from Politico. And as terrifying as this is and as exhausted as I'm sure you are, we really have to talk about it. We have to understand in vivid, visceral detail the stakes of this election, not just if Donald Trump wins, which would be disastrous, and we've been talking about that for a year, but the stakes that exist and the consequences, even if Trump loses, because that's not a clear path. There is still a threat and a danger on that path as well, as demonstrated by this new information. So Axios did a deep dive into this poll. 1 in 5 Republicans want Trump to call election invalid if he loses. Nearly 1 in 5 Republicans say that if Trump loses the 2024 election, he should declare the results invalid and do whatever it takes to assume office, according to a new national survey. The growing number of Republicans willing to shun democratic norms and possibly embrace violence comes as Trump continues to falsely claim that the 2020 election was stolen from him and saying that the 2024 election is already rigged. The survey from the Nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and Brookings Institution is the latest sign of how Trump's grievances and conspiracy theories have reshaped his party and whipped up its most disaffected far-right elements. Meanwhile, nearly 3 in 10 Republicans believe that true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country, compared with 16% of independents and 8% of Democrats. Quote, "I've been doing this for 20 years, and these answers are keeping me up at night," Robert P. Jones, president and founder of PRRI, tells Axios. Jones says that those supporting the loser of the election doing whatever it takes to assume office are essentially endorsing a coup against the United States. Quote, "It's all pretty dark and worrisome." That is staggering. Now, it's not surprising in the sense that we actually have polls from a year and 2 and 3 years ago on which this is commensurate. This idea that an increasing number of Republicans think that violence is necessary to, quote unquote, reclaim the country, that's been evident in polling since the 2020 election. This is not new, but it's not going away. The sentiment is still there. Absolutely staggering. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that number of Republicans in terms of those who want Trump to declare the election invalid increase as we get even closer to the election. Now, that poll and its implications are bad enough. 20% of Republicans wanting Trump to declare the results invalid if he loses and do whatever it takes to assume office. 30% of Republicans say violence might be necessary to do it. All of this is actually related to a deep dive that Politico did about an unlikely, admittedly unlikely, but very plausible path for Trump to potentially steal the 2024 election and succeed where he failed. So they wrote an article about this. We don't have time to read the whole thing. Otherwise, we'll be here for like 3 hours, but we are going to read some of it. And we're going to look to Kyle Cheney's tweets. Kyle Cheney was one of the 4 writers of this article, this deep dive, for additional context. So here's the intro. 4 years ago, a sitting president, rejected by American voters, attempted to seize a second term anyway, plunging the nation into confusion, conflict, and, in its last gasp, violence. Now Donald Trump's political comeback has revived a sense of dread among the officials and institutions who stood in his way last time. Could it happen again? Dozens of interviews with people deeply familiar or involved with the election process point to a clear consensus. Not only could Trump make a second attempt at overturning an election he loses, he and his allies are already laying the groundwork. Quote, "The threat remains," end quote, said Tim Heaphy, who led the investigation into Trump's election subversion efforts for the House's January 6th Select Committee. There is some good news. 2024 is not 2020. Trump's path to pulling it off this time is even narrower and more extreme. For one thing, Trump lacks some of the tools he threatened to wield 4 years ago to upend the transfer of power. Today, the military and Justice Department answer to President Biden. Trump also needs allies to win elections that would put them in a position to reverse a defeat. Overturning Vice President Harris's victory would require an enormous amount of help from Republican power brokers in state houses and Congress, some of whom spurned him 4 years ago. Trump's first attempt to exploit the neglected machinery of American democracy also spurred real action by congressional Democrats. Updates to the Electoral Count Act in the wake of Trump's 2020 gambit aimed to bind vote counters, election officials, and even Congress to the results certified by state governments, all of which makes it tougher, in theory, to steal an election. But, this is the big but, Trump is heading into the 2024 election informed by his failure to overturn the results 4 years earlier. He has learned. And his incentive to obtain the powers and protections of the White House is even likely stronger than ever, because if he loses, Trump will face an avalanche of criminal proceedings that could last the rest of his life. If he wins, they're likely to go away. So think about that. Yes, the path is narrower, but Trump is even more motivated than ever because his liberty is potentially on the line, life and liberty. He's 78 years old. There's no telling what these legal entanglements would do to the rest of his life. And he's learned. He understands. He had an attempt. This is an iterative process. He and his allies know how they failed last time and are planning accordingly. Quote, no one knows exactly what Trump's attack on the electoral system will be in 2024, said Jamie Raskin. Quote, what will he do this time? The answer, according to lawmakers, congressional investigators, party operatives, election officials, and constitutional law experts, goes something like this. He will deepen distrust in the election results by making unsupported or hyperbolic claims of widespread voter fraud and mounting long-shot lawsuits, challenging enough ballots to flip the outcome in key states. He will lean on friendly county and state officials to resist certifying election results, a futile errand that would nevertheless fuel a campaign to put pressure on elected Republican legislators in state houses and Congress. He will call on allies in GOP-controlled swing state legislatures to appoint alternate presidential electors. And he did that before. He did create fake electors as part of the 2020 election. And as a matter of fact, many of them are facing criminal charges as a consequence of their participation in his conspiracy to commit fraud. Food for thought. He will rely on congressional Republicans to endorse these alternate electors, fake electors, I wish the article would just call them that, or at least reject Democratic electors when they try to convene to certify the outcome. He will try to ensure that Vice President Harris is denied 270 votes in the Electoral College, sending the election to the House, where Republicans are likely to have the numbers to choose Trump as the next president. Because remember, even if, this is important, even if Democrats win the House of Representatives, which we need to try like hell to do, if the election is tossed to the House of Representatives, which is the constitutional process if 270 electoral votes are not reached, it's not the total number of representatives in the House. So it's not like a Democratic majority could just vote for Harris. It goes by state delegations. And basically, there are more Republican states than Democratic states, even if there are more Democrats in the House. One of the many, many, many institutional advantages that Republicans have created for themselves. Some of the necessary ingredients for this extraordinary campaign are in place. Trump has already embarked on a clear mission to stoke as much uncertainty as possible about the results of this election. He claims the only way he can lose to Harris is if Democrats cheat, despite no evidence that any significant fraud occurred in 2020 or is underway in 2024. Dutiful allies have amplified these messages, and many of the officials who stood in Trump's path 4 years ago have been ousted or retired, ceding power to more compliant Trump-aligned successors. Before we go on, that's another big one. Remember, institutions, even American institutions, are not divinely crafted nor divinely enforced. This is not an episode of Supernatural. This is not the magical contract that Ursula created in The Little Mermaid. These institutions have to be enforced by people. And if the people enforcing these institutions, or a sufficient number of them, are bad faith actors, the institutions cannot maintain. It's totally dependent on the people running them. That's the point. Meanwhile, threats against election officials and growing fears of civil unrest have intensified, potentially at polling places, ballot counting facilities, and electoral college ceremonies, which Trump detractors worry could bolster any election subversion campaign. Of course, Trump, and it goes on how Trump's allies say that, he's not worried about post-election contingencies. He's worried about beating Harris outright. But it also notes he refused again this week to publicly say he would back the peaceful transfer of power. And the article also notes the Trump campaign declined to comment for this article about what they may or may not do if Trump loses the upcoming election. It's possible Trump and his allies won't make a sustained effort to overturn his election defeat. An overwhelming Harris victory would make it harder for Trump to rally Republicans to his side. If Trump wins, no one expects a comparable effort by Democrats to subvert the election. So again, indicating that more people are far more concerned about Republicans might do in the face of a losing election than Democrats. But again, number two, An overwhelming Harris victory is something I hope for, but it is unlikely based on the data we have. Based on the data we have, if Harris wins, and that's an if, it's effectively a 50-50 election, it will be by the skin of her teeth. So, food for thought. But to a person, election observers, elected leaders, and some of Trump's own allies agree on one operating premise. On election night, no matter what the results show, how many votes remain uncounted, and how many advisors tell him otherwise, Donald Trump will declare himself the winner, which is what he did in 2020. And from there, he could embark on a risky but plausible challenge to overturn the legitimate election results and install himself in the White House. Here's how it could happen. And it goes into detail. It's a long article discussing in vivid detail the step-by-step process that Trump could employ. Again, unlikely, but plausible. Very plausible and dependent on so much good faith that, quite frankly, I don't think we have any basis to assume. It requires Republicans to act in good faith. I feel that that is always, at best, a risky proposition and more often than not, a losing proposition. One of the big ones, as Kyle Cheney, one of the writers in this article, points out on Twitter, notably, Speaker Johnson has not said whether he thinks the Electoral Count Act, the new one, which beefed up what the vice president is supposed to do and how Congress is supposed to certify the results of the election. Speaker Johnson has not said whether he thinks the Electoral Count Act is constitutional and binding on Congress. His office repeatedly declined to clarify his view. So Mike Johnson, if he remains Speaker of the House on January 6, 2021, basically, if Republicans keep the majority in the upcoming election, it's entirely possible that Johnson will employ his enhanced power to engage in shenaniganry to help Donald Trump steal the election. I want you to remember, MAGA Mike Johnson in 2020, when he was not the Speaker of the House, he was just a Republican congressman, co-signed and masterminded many of Donald Trump's quote-unquote legal attempts to steal the election from President Biden. So why the hell would we assume that a much more powerful Speaker, Mike Johnson, would do anything but try to help Trump steal this election? We have no reason to assume otherwise. Mike Johnson embodies bad faith. And given the stakes and given how manic and desperate Trump is, we have no reason to assume anything other than that Johnson will be even more bad faith, which is why we don't just need to win the White House. We need to win the Senate, keep the Senate, and we need to take back the House. And this is the important part for the House. The House of Representatives, a new majority would be gavelled in before January 6, 2021, before the Electoral College votes are certified. So if Democrats take a majority in the House in the November election, Hakeem Jeffries would become Speaker before the Electoral College votes are certified. And if Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker of the House, then again, the possible but unlikely path for Trump to steal this election becomes even less possible and more unlikely. That's another reason why we don't just need to vote for Kamala Harris. We need to just vote Democrat, vote blue, vote blue, vote blue, vote blue. There is no room, in my opinion, for a single elected Republican in the federal government because none of them can be trusted. It's a cult. So again, I don't want to beat a dead horse on this, and I know a lot of people are exhausted by the state of the election, but we have to understand the stakes. The stakes if Donald Trump wins are incredibly high, but the stakes if Donald Trump loses are still very important as well. And Donald Trump and MAGA Republican politicians and many members of his cult have demonstrated that they want him to win, come hell or high water, even if he loses. An increasing number are saying just declare yourself the winner, do whatever it takes to get in office, even if it involves violence. We have to show that the MAGA way will only ever end in electoral defeat. And that is the only way we could potentially salvage the Republican Party and avoid a really dangerous situation for our country. We have to defeat them decisively in November at the ballot box in every jurisdiction for every office, president, Senate, House, none. Make it your mission to vote so that there is no elected Republican left in the federal government. Try to vote them all out where they are on the ballot, not a single one. That should be the goal because the stakes are so high. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.